Uyayazi indoda. Yima uyayazi indoda. Sawuzingomba isifuba nje namhlanje ngobudoda. Yima uyayazi indoda.
Umasinde zama ngufukuza phumelele indoda inomqolo umzekelo wendoda ndimi iyazazi sukaphi iyazazi singele phi uyayazi indoda.
Indoda yindoda ezekamzekweni ngobudoda bayo. Indoda nguzimele geqe into afunga ingajiki. Khumbulani kaloku madoda ubudoda kukuphangalala kwengqondo. Ubudoda kukuphangalala kwengqondo. Maqatha likhulu uyayazi indoda.
Lisiko nesithethe imemaxhantini iyanqumla ibizwa ungwevuze ekhaya ndikuxelela ngendoda ubuqubayo. Indoda yintsika yekhaya abakhuluwana abaninawo bajonge kuyo. Zithi inkqwithelo zobomi xa zifike endodeni izikhuthaze ngelithi naleni izawugqitha ithemba libulali liyadanisa. Uyayazi indoda.
Bafana bamXhosa ixesha lotyelelo lifikile. Ke hambani nihambe niyokuqinisa ubudoda. Xebe nje nifane nizibize amadoda. Ze niqine niqiqe niqonde niqondisise. Kaloku le nto indoda iqiqe iqonde iqondisise. Iya iqinele ngaphakathi. Indoda iyazikisisa ukucinga. Indoda ayikwenze okungalunganga. Yemaqatha likhuni uyayazi indoda.
Ukubhadla kuthengiswa ukuqiqa kubolekisi yenzani nxamnya nesidoda. Abantu mababone neneni ningamadoda emadodeni ningakulinge ningcolisa ubudoda ngokwenza izinto ezingekhoyo. Ubudoda buqala ngezenzo khanenzeni isidoda nibe ngamadoda kwenene ekuhlaleni abantu babone eneneni lawaya ngamadoda. Ngumaqatha likhuni noMonwabisi the poet uyayazi indoda.
Monwabisi the poet eBhalfo.
We're excited today to be hosting Pastor Vuyo Mkhonwana, based in East London. And he's somebody who's passionate about young people. He's passionate about ministry. He leads a church at the moment here in East London. He's worked for institutions like Youth for Christ, Scripture Union. And at the moment, he is working with Heartlines. So he's somebody who's very passionate, very gifted, and has a focus on the next generation. He has a lot to give to the next generation. And is also very helpful to the topic that we're trying to tackle today. It's a very complicated and sensitive topic, but it is a topic that all of us cannot avoid. And so it's important when we approach topics like this to approach them from a biblical perspective. And that's what he is going to help us with today. But there's also a need for us to understand the culture. There's a need for us to engage the culture. And I like to use the word redeem the culture, because sometimes we see culture as something that is demonic, that needs to be sort of set aside, but there's no culture that is demonic, and there's no culture that is perfect either. So we want to redeem those parts of our culture that are not glorifying the Lord, and so embrace those parts that are glorifying to the Lord. So we're excited to have Pastor Vuyo. He's actually doing his PhD on the topic that we're dealing with today. And so I'm very, very excited to have him here with us. But Pastor Vuyo, if I've left out some information, won't you just please share a little bit about yourself, your ministry, where you're at in terms of your ministry at the moment?
Please, thank you so much for the opportunity that you are giving me today in this platform. I really appreciate it. Indeed, Vuyo Mkhonwana. I was born in Whittlesea, but raised here in East London. I'm married to Sia Sanga for the past 24 years. We are blessed with 2 kids. We work here in Cambridge location. I've been a minister here for 25 years this coming November. I very passionate about young people, development of abantu, holistic, the transformation or the redemption of umntu as a whole. My passion is really to see the manifestation of the truth of the gospel in our reality. I believe that scriptures are real. What God says in his word, it transcends time, transcends generation. It is applicable in every situation. So yeah, I'm someone that is living to see that. And I believe that part of the responsibility, actually the responsibility of the church is to collaborate with God to bring the kingdom of God on earth. and the kingdom in its nature is transformative. I believe that if we would live out kingdom values and allow God to permeate our lives and live through us, we could live in a better world and not be religious. I also believe, as far as culture is concerned, that indeed what you're saying is true. There is no such thing as a culture that is holy or perfect, but culture by its nature is not static, but it is evolving. Many people, they want to remain in the past, and think that culture is about those wearing skin coats and all of those things. And when you come and you talk about the developments that are there in the culture, people want to dismiss them as if they are not part of the culture. But on the other side, they want to embrace the development that is there, but throw away some of the things and dismiss them. Somehow there is what I would say a disconnect or a lack of understanding in terms of what the culture is. We seem to be lost a lot, in particular as the Black people, between what I would call customs and rites. We seem to mix those two and wanting to make them the same. So somehow topics like this, they help us to be able to kind of be able to separate things and make things clear, so that people are able to understand what is it that should remain and what is it that changes with time. So once again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, sir, and really appreciate the introduction that you've given us as well. And leading us to the first question is, what would you say, Tata, is Ulwaluko? There's a lot of people who watch our program, a lot of them not from our culture. Some of them are Zulu, some of them are Sotho, some of them are from outside of South Africa. And so it's very nice, maybe as we begin delving into this topic of Xhosa masculinities, maybe to just explain the process of Ulwaluko. Just give us some background as to what it is.
Sure. I think firstly, it's important to say that Ulwaluko is a rite of passage for Xhosa boys from where they transform, so to say, or where they move from a stage where they are boys and getting into a stage where now they enter the stage of adulthood, where they now have through that transition, they enter a stage of manhood. It is a rite of passage that, if one looks at, firstly, look at its purpose, its original intention, what it was intended for, is that when we look first, is that Ulwaluko was a school that our forefathers used to train young men to become young males or young men who understand their responsibility in life. It is a stage which had a number of things in it. First, it was the surgical part, which had its own connotation or beliefs connected to it. And part of that, when the part of the surgical circumcision had passed, then the school would begin, where people were taught about, one, their culture, the politics, where they were trained how to fight, where they were taught about values of them as a people. So it was really a time which took about a year, where these young men were set apart to be trained, where they were taken out of the community and where they would live with men that are trusted within the community, whom the community know that they would pass values to these young men who have a responsibility to protect their nation or their clans, and to make sure that it remains protected and it is productive. What would happen is that if one looks at our history, we'll find that it was not each family deciding when to send their children to the circumcision school, but boys would be sent together with a son of a chief or a king, where they would go through this process together, because somehow, I think that the thinking was that since they are of the same age group, they are the people that are going to work together. So they are taken together at this time of training, and they are trained and they are taught. And through that that season, they also get to connect and know each other very deeply. So it was not just about the wound, but it was the socialization and the training, the development of boys, where they are trained to become men who have a responsibility in society. So basically, that is what it is. The understanding that was there, it's a rite of passage for young boys who transition from boys to manhood.
I love that. I like the way that you've put it. I always say to a lot of young people is, some things are initially created with good intentions, but then a bit later on get distorted. And you also mentioned a bit earlier that culture is not static, it's moving.
Yes.
And
yes.
we do see people like Ushaka Zulu changing this practice. And,
Yes.
He looked in his kingdom and he thought, this is not helpful, so we have to establish a new culture that fits the time and that sort of stuff. But I always say to people, I do think that young men should go through some form of, I don't want to call it initiation, but, a point where we officially say you're no longer a boy. You're no longer expected to act like a boy, but we now expect you to act like a man. But we need to train you in a certain way so that we can have that expectation having equipped you. So the question then that would follow then is, would you say that the Bible affirms Ulwaluko in its original intent, and is it a good thing in its purest form?
I think when one looks at the Bible, one has to look at a number of things. One has to look at, firstly, if we talk about Xhosa circumcision, and then we look at biblical circumcision, would say those are two different things. One was a covenant circumcision, which was a sign of obedience and of accepting a covenant between the children of Israel and God. Ours is what I would call a cultural circumcision. It is the coming of age of a person from one stage of life to another. So the other one is covenant. The other one, it's a transition in terms of stages. But if one looks at the intention, both in terms of God's intention in terms of that circumcision, which was a covenant circumcision, and you look at what the Xhosa people had in terms of the training of their young men so that they become men who are responsible, one would say to a great extent there is no much disjuncture, except that the other one, it was what God was saying, I need you to be able to do this as a commitment to me, that you will follow my ways. And one of the things that is very interesting for me as I study scriptures and I look at our culture, it is the similarities that you find in terms of the value system, in terms of what is required, in terms of, for an example, if we look at a small scripture, a small verse which is, I would say, it's tucked in the book of Genesis, chapter 19, verse 18, when the angels were on their way to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. We read in verse number 18, where it says, when the angels were on their way to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, they had a conversation among themselves, and they asked each other, shall we hide from Abraham that which we are now going to do. And they begin to say something very interesting. They say, because we have chosen Abraham to teach his children and his household righteousness and justice, then we will fulfill the promise that we have given to him. Now, when one looks at God's intention, and when he looks at what was happening in the world, and when you look at the whole of the Old Testament, you see that God's problem with all of mankind and God's desire in raising up a nation through Abraham was that the world was wicked, and there was a lot of lawlessness where there is no justice and righteousness, and he wanted to develop a people that had these values, which are kingdom values, so to say. Now, if one looks at our culture in its purest form, one begins to understand, when you look at it, you look at the intentions, the similarities that are there, that the intention, even as far as Black people or organized Xhosa people have been concerned, was that they wanted to see a just world, and they then knew the responsibility that males have to play in making sure that society becomes that which is pure, sorry, that which is righteous and just. So in a way, there are similarities, even though the point of departure is not the same, but the intention is the same. So
that's very well put.
Thank you, sir. What also I have seen also in terms of today's church, so to say, is that part of a number of believers are trying to redeem circumcision to an extent that people are using a term where they speak of Ulwaluko lwevangeli, circumcision of the gospel, so to say, where they where they try to, I'm sorry for the term that I'm going to use, where in a way they seek to redeem the culture to a great extent by sanitizing it, and not digging deep and seeking to address issues that will be able to restore the original intentions of the practice, and also make sure that we produce a God-like nation, so to say. Part of the problem for me, I'm using the word sanitizing intentionally, in that we want to achieve in 3 weeks to 4 weeks what had taken previous generations 1 year, 6 months, and before that, and also that had a stable society where the role of men was clear, where the fathers were at home, and all of those things, into a society where over 51% of males are not at home, and even those that are at home do not know what their responsibilities are, and where most boys grow up in an environment where they are not clear about what the role of men is about. So when then we remove alcohol, for an example, and we remove the slaughtering of animals, and we have prayer and scripture reading only for 3 weeks, and then when that is over, we come and celebrate and say we have produced a godly people, which to a great extent, if we then look statistically, we find that to a great extent, a number of boys that have gone through circumcision in the same way, through Ulwaluko lwevangeli, some of them, in terms of how they live their life, they live their lives in the almost similar way like those who have gone through Ulwaluko, through slaughtering of goats, going through amagqirha and all of those things, and where there has been alcohol in their celebrations, because somehow, in terms of us trying to redeem, we are not dealing with the root causes. So in a way, in answering your question, I say there are similarities and the intention is the same, even though the point of departures are not the same. Yeah.
That's very helpful, sir. And I think you've also touched on something very interesting now, because there's a separation, from the way that the world does it and the way that the church is doing it.
Sure.
And I like the fact that you are saying this used to be a year-long journey that these young men would be on. And now we are trying to achieve it in 4 weeks, 3 weeks. And I think for me, discipleship into biblical manhood is something that seems to just jump off my head as you are talking, to say, why don't we take them on a journey from January to December, knowing what December, the ceremony will be there, but let's begin that journey with them from January. You might even say, okay, you can spend 2 weeks or 3 weeks in the wilderness, but that's not all that manhood is, to just live in the bush. And there are valuable lessons to be learned there. But what about starting that journey? Meet with them regularly, do some manly things, teach them what does it mean to be a man? Because I think for me, the part where I like the most is that we need to train men, to be providers, to be masculine. If there's something that needs to be fixed at home, they must fix it. Then the question would be, what are those parts that we can redeem in the culture before we can say we're bringing in the Christian and biblical stuff? But what are the stuff that we can say are essential, and even stuff that we can say we think even other nations could benefit from that practice? Yeah,
sure. I think first and foremost, I like the example that you first touched on, the issue of them knowing the responsibility of manhood, because part of what, for example, used to happen in the past is that, one, the issue of people at home cooking for the initiates was not there. The initiate had to create a home for themselves there. They had to plant, they had to look after livestock, and all they will be able to make their food while there no one will send anything there. Now, what we do today is that we do everything for them. And they come from there not having learned anything.
Doesn't help.
All of those things. Exactly. So then we expect them to know what it means to be a man. So when even in society, we have not had what in the past community fathers would do, what today is called social fathers, where men in the society, or in the area, would in a way disciple those boys, look after them, correct them, teach them work even before they go to the initiation school. So today we don't have that. It's a man for himself. If there's no father, they're raised by a single mother, she will see what she does with them. So there are a number of things that have been there in the past that are not there today, that we have to ask ourselves questions concerning them. What do we do in a place of this? Part of the things which young men were taught, it was, one, how to treat women. For an example, we know of the idea of ukungenwa kobuhlanti ngasemva. I don't know whether are you familiar with the concept, where when a young man would sleep with a girl and impregnate her, that was termed as ukungenwa kobuhlanti ngasemva, meaning that you are coming into this home to steal the cattle or the wealth of this home without having taken the responsibility of paying a dowry to make sure that you've got a wife. And number two, the importance of sexual purity, which young men and young girls were taught, that you keep yourself pure until marriage. The sanctity of life, that if you impregnate a girl, that girl becomes automatically your wife, because it was not allowed that your seed will be raised by someone else. So your family would then have a responsibility to make sure that if you have impregnated someone's child, your family will then have to take a responsibility to make sure that that girl got married into your home, and number two, that that child is raised within the family. The third element, it was the issue of community. The concept of Ubuntu is also part of what young initiates were taught on, as they are taught the politics, as they are taught about the history, and also as they are taught about their responsibility. Part of that concept had been the idea that I am because you are. So that concept, it is such a critical concept, because it is a concept that dealt with the whole issue of individualism. Individualism did not exist because in the worldview of the Xhosa people or Bantu people, is that the collective is more important than the individual. And that is why for young people and members of society, the issue of me living for society was a critical one. And that is why for a number of us, the concept that today seem to want to gain traction of black tax is a foreign concept, because we understand that if I am blessed one way or the other to be able to have a breakthrough, I cannot move ahead alone. As I move ahead, I must go back, pull back my brothers and sisters, pull back people from my community, because we know that a glass house, if I build a glass house in the midst of poverty, people will throw stones into my house, and therefore I will never be able to enjoy my glass house. But if I help everyone else to be able to build glass houses, there is no one who would take a stone and throw a stone into the glass house, because they themselves also are living in a glass house. So the whole concept of Ubuntu, I am because we are, was such a critical one. And that is one of the things that circumcision was teaching and bringing into our young people, for them to be able to understand that as a man, I have a responsibility to protect society. I have a responsibility to protect women. I have a responsibility to make sure that we move forward as a group, as a people. And that is why you find that with wars, for families and young men to lose their lives, it was not an issue, because the idea of the collective was more important than the comfort of the individual. So those are some of the things that I believe that as a people and Ulwaluko, it's one of the contribution that it could contribute to society, especially when you look at where we are as a nation. Where, for an example, if we look in terms of our economy, we look at the gap between the rich and the poor, the abuse of the state resources. Those are some of the things that show that even though we still have the practice of Ulwaluko, but we have not kept the values. We have only kept the circumcision part without keeping the value system that it's supposed to endorse or teach.
Yes,
so those are some of the things that I think that while we are redeeming circumcision, those are the things that we should be focusing on more than the surgical wound.
I think you touched on something. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that you've mentioned, which I think are so beneficial. I think that, you know, the philosophy of Ubuntu helping to guide the young person who's now come out of this process, and those values really protect everything that they have learned. It's almost
Sure.
like everything that holds everything together.
Sure.
But I'm also noticing in society today that, we've got this mentality of individualism, is that if I work for the government or if I work for a big company, and we think everything is fine because I'm fine. And we don't
Sure.
really think that the world is a better place when all of us are prospering and when we're seeking
Sure.
the prosperity of others. Because if my community is prospering in terms of education, everybody's got a job, nobody's going to be committing crime, which the crime affects me. So
Yes,
I've
sir.
got to work to help the society to become better, because at the end of the day, it has an impact on me. And I've noticed even a lot of our white brothers and sisters, they are doing Ubuntu more than us. You'll find somebody
Yeah.
will become a rich business person, but they'll still be sponsoring their, a school, their local school,
Sure.
where their own
Sure.
children are going, because they know
Sure.
from that school there might be a doctor that will come out of there and they will save your life one day.
Exactly.
So really, and these are our values, because their
Yes, sir.
traditions are more individualistic. They
Sure.
are living out our
Mm.
values. We're not holding
Sure.
really truly
Sure.
who we are, and we are supposed to be actually living out those values and people learning from us. So that's one of just the things that you've touched on, which is very essential. But I want to just get into the lessons, the morality that some of
Sure.
our young people are learning in these initiation schools. And we find people going in there and then coming out worse than they are. And then
Yeah.
there's this mindset, I've got to sleep with as many women
Yeah.
as possible. If he didn't drink now, he drinks. And he doesn't
Yeah.
respect his mother. He doesn't respect his
Sure.
father. It's this toxic
The man now.
masculinity. Yes.
Mm.
So maybe in terms of this redeeming of the culture, I think there's certainly something that goes wrong there with the
Sure.
people that are teaching our boys. And is it right for us to just let them dump them there for 2 weeks and say, we'll see you in 2 weeks' time? What should we do? How do we redeem?
Go on holiday.
Yeah, go on. I'll pick you up later.
Sure. I think we have lost quite a lot of things, and I think it's one of the things that concerns me as a person, is that what we seem to have is a shell of what used to be. A typical example, what we most times have as amakangata, your initiate nurses, it's young people who have no direction in life, who abuse alcohol, who are not working, but who have gone through circumcision, and who they themselves find the being there and help young men as a form of making money. What we have done wrong in recent past is that we have not followed our practices where, for an example, a man who becomes your initiate nurse, ikangata, would be a man that is respected within the community, who is known for right behavior, who is known to be an example, who is known also to have passion or compassion for other young men, whom the parents, when they are sending their children to this man, they will know that he will impart the values of the community. They would not just take any person. I remember when I went through that, it was my uncle, a husband to my father's sister, who was an elder in the Presbyterian church, an elder, a man of good standing in society, a responsible father, a worker, whom, when we were going through the process, was very strict in terms of how we should behave. He was always there to teach us what is required of us as young men. But today, when you look in terms of what is happening, is that we have stopped using those men, or men of that caliber seem to be diminishing within society. We have a rise of men who lack values, who are given over to alcohol, who don't value sexual purity and all of those things. So what they do is that when they are there, they find an opportunity to have understudies whom they teach this behavior that is not right. And most of the time, because also there's this whole issue of alcohol that parents themselves seem to sponsor, where they make sure that there must be alcohol there, and which is also against our culture. But to a great extent, we don't want to talk about those things. When you talk about them, those who are ignorant of their culture, they say you are attacking the culture. But the truth is, alcohol use within the Xhosa nation was something that is not acceptable, except in certain circumstances. I remember also when I was growing up, my grandmother had a kist. And in that kist, she had a bottle of brandy, which when it is cold, she will take the lid and pour the brand in it and swallow that, and also give us that, which helped with cold, because growing up in Whittlesea, it is very cold. And generally that generation knew that alcohol is not intended to be abused. If we could use the word ukunxila, was something that was frowned upon. To become drunk or to become a drunkard. But today, it is something that is in, it is something that is part of a culture. And what is happening sometimes in some of these initiate houses, you find that from the time the initiate went in to the time they go up, that place becomes a shebeen. And how can you teach a young man to be men in that environment? And even the men that are there, they themselves are always drunk. To an extent that in some situations, some initiates, they lose their manhood as a result of neglect and people understanding the sanctity of circumcision, because within the Xhosa people, circumcision was seen as something sacred. But we have lost all of those values. As a result, we have all these problems that we have. So basically, we need to kind of go back and say, what are those things that we must really make sure that we keep, and be honest with ourselves, that the way that things are, where we're taking any jig and Jill to become ikangata, is not going to take us anywhere. We need to find men of right standing, men who are example, men who are able to lead themselves, to be the ones that are there, and who to an extent will be able to impart right knowledge and they themselves being an example. So I think somehow we need to be honest with ourselves and say, what type of men do we have? And also, to the boys or the young men who are now initiate nurses, amakangata, are they the right people to be doing this work? Yes, sir.
I think you've answered it very well, and leads me maybe to the second challenge. For someone who is a Christian, you've got also the practice of some form of a sacrifice that would be performed during the ceremony or the welcoming ceremony of some sort. And if you can just share a little bit of what sort of, how does it usually happen? Maybe for people who don't know, is there some form of an introduction to the ancestors? How would it typically work in our modern form? And maybe then just throw some light in terms of the biblical understanding, because there's a conflict there, obviously, with this ancestral practice, with the biblical worldview. Yeah. So the first question would be, what is the typical practice in terms of the ancestors? And then how should we as Christians approach it? Yeah.
Okay. I think if one looks at those who are not believers, or the belief around that, is that when one goes into the circumcision school, there is a spiritual war that takes place. Allow me to use that word. There is a spiritual war that takes place to an extent that some families would then take their child before they undertake this to a traditional healer. Others, they would say, ikhwele, to strengthen them, to protect them against the forces of darkness. Because people understand that during the time of this process, certain forces begin to come in and all of those things. So they will then take a child through that process where and secondly, Peter Mtuze, one of the academics within this field and the Xhosa man, speaks of the spilling of the blood, both through the circumcision process and also through the slaughtering of the animals, which is a connecting factor between the living dead, is Nyanya, and the initiate, where they say the initiate is introduced to their own ancestors through the spilling of the blood. So there's a strong belief around this to an extent that some people would go to an extent that when an initiate is supposed to go through, they would slaughter a goat or an animal that they call ingubo, which they say it's what a person was supposed to have received when they were a child, which they did not. And then they would slaughter another one, and they will even slaughter another one after 7 days as a way of celebration and all of those things, appeasing ancestors. But for those of us who believe, one, we know that, firstly, looking in terms of our culture and its purity, Xhosa people did not share blood for any reason except it be really, really, really necessary that they shed blood, because they knew that the moment you shed blood, there is a spiritual connection that takes place one way or the other. And therefore, that is why even when people would go into a traditional ceremony, before people would eat of anything that is slaughtered, someone would say, "Inzwi," meaning that we need a word. We need to know why is this thing slaughtered. And in people who know Xhosa culture and religious beliefs, once they hear why this animal is slaughtered and they know that the reason is not right, they will not partake of that food. Some men will take it yasizabo and get out of that kraal in that family and say, "I asn't she." You see, because there's a deep understanding about the shedding of the blood. You see, so for us who believe, we know that the moment you shed blood, one, we know that Christ has been our sacrificial lamb. There is no longer any shedding of blood that is needed. Two, we know, medically speaking, slaughtering a goat has no impact on the healing of the wound. And it has no impact on who I become as a man. And therefore, there's to a great extent, there is no reason except to celebrate that now we are celebrating this child or this young man who was a boy. Now he has gone to the circumcision. We are welcoming him back at home, and it's a great thing, to an extent that I have even in my own family, because I'm as a senior man now in my family, I've taken 3 boys through this whole process. I don't even slaughter something ngexesha lokotshisa, because of one thing, that when unbelievers celebrate the 7 days by slaughtering a sheep or a goat, that they name it and connect it to something. When I do that for males in my family, people will not notice the difference. That's one. Number 2, I will confuse my children, because they will not see the difference. They will think that our father or our uncle have slaughtered at this thing when we were going through this thing, and when we're celebrating the first 7 days of this thing, and therefore it is normal. So I simply say what we do is that we change food, and that's it. If we slaughter something, we will do it when we're celebrating the homecoming, because we have to be able to bring about a clear distinction between these things. So for us who believe in Christ, there is no reason for us to slaughter anything. Yes, sir.
I think you put it very well. I really appreciate that. And my last question to you would be then, how should we navigate through, these practices? Because obviously a lot of our family members will probably subscribe to what we've just described, the slaughtering, the alcohol. We have these people who are supposed to teach our men when they go into the school, but they are ungodly. And I went to speak at First City Baptist to the youth group, and one of the young boys said to me, our parents are not Christians, and we are still going to have to go to Mgidini. How do I navigate through this thing now? There's the ancestral worship, there's the alcohol, there's all these lessons that are ungodly that I'm going to learn, and all these things coming at me. How do I, as a young man, deal with this?
I think for me, first is that we as males who are born again, who are in the church, who believe in the scriptures, we need to take responsibility in terms of, 1, doing what we are doing. That's 1. 2, we need to write things that relates to this. 3, we need to commit ourselves to discipling young boys and young men in the church. 4, we need to teach those young men whose parents are not believers that they should ask their parents for permission not to go through that. But if their parents insist that it is what they want, it is okay. They must go through that. It's not going to affect them, because it is a matter of belief. It's a matter of faith. Yeah. So as long they know the truth and they tell them the truth, a time will come when it is them that then must then practice this thing. Then they're able to turn things around. So one can be able to convince. There are many young people whom have asked their parents for permission not to go through, and their parents have allowed them. And some, they have asked people who have knowledge in the church to come and speak to their parents. And parents, when they've heard this thing, they then open up and say, no, we have no objection, go ahead, and we have seen it, it works. I think it's just that people are fearful of something that they don't know, because there is a lot of myth that goes with this whole thing, So part of what we do is that part of the problem, as far as the church is concerned, is the arrogance that we have. We tend to be very arrogant. We tend to be very judgmental. We tend to come from a high position, not from a position of educating and helping people to know the truth, but we come judging people, telling them all manner of things that this. And I think that attitude is the attitude that creates animosity, and that creates people where they want to fight with this thing, even though some of them deep down in their heart, they know the truth. But because of the manner in which many times we approach them, then they come out gun blazing, wanting to fight even for what they know that it is wrong. So basically, I think we just need to change the way that we think, and then we need to be able to put up teachings, write things, and be willing to mentor young boys and walk the journey with them.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Can we expect a book from you soon on Xhosa masculinities?
I hope so. I hope so. There's something that I'm working on. I'm hoping that when I'm done with my studies, I will turn that into a book and followed up with some other works that also will follow that. Because it's something that I believe in, that if as a church we begin to pioneer certain things, we'll be able to see transformation. I know parents want what is right for their children, and I know that many people, they see that there's something that is wrong with how we are doing things, and they want to see change, but it matters how we approach the whole issue.
Thank you so much, sir, for your time. I think a lot of people will be blessed by this session that we've had together, and I think a lot of people are wrestling with these things. We're living in a time now where there's some form of a renaissance of African spirituality, and so it calls on us as Christians to be alert, to also have a biblical worldview that can help us to discern what is happening in the culture and really hold on to our biblical worldview without wavering. And I think abantu like Pastor Vuyo are here to help us navigate through it. And there's another interview that he's done also on YouTube as well, very similar to this one. And I've seen a few of his teachings as well on YouTube. So I want to encourage you to subscribe to his channel there. If you just search him as Vuyo Mkhonwana, I think you can find him there. And he's also a gifted teacher, and so I'm sure you'll be blessed also by his ministry as well. And we look forward to seeing a book coming from you, sir, in the future. So thank you so much for your time, and we hope that your ministry will continue to glorify God and continue to just help a lot of people. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir, for your time and also for inviting me. The Lord bless you, and thank you to the viewers for having me. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.